Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The morning arrived cloaked in a soft gray mist, the kind that clung to the earth like a whispered secret. Tieu Nuong woke to the sound of the wind whistling through the gaps in her makeshift tent, a fragile shelter perched on the edge of a quiet field. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint tang of wildflowers that grew along the riverbank nearby. She rose from her mat, her movements slow and deliberate, and tied her faded blue shirt around her waist, its edges frayed from years of wear. The familiar sounds of the countryside greeted her, the distant crowing of roosters, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft murmur of the river that ran like a silver thread through the village. She stepped outside, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth, and surveyed the small patch of land where she grew her vegetables. The plants stood tall, their leaves glistening with dew, but the tent's roof sagged under the weight of last night's rain, a quiet reminder of her precarious existence. Tieu Nuong bent down, her hands brushing against the cool, damp leaves of her greens, her fingers lingering on the rough texture of a cabbage. She had planted these with care, each seed a small act of hope, a promise of survival in a world that had offered her little kindness. She was an orphaned girl, cast out by the only family she'd ever known, her uncle, who had chased her from their home years ago, his words sharp as thorns, his eyes cold with misunderstanding. She had been a child then, too young to understand the weight of his accusations, too young to fight back. Now she was alone, her only companions the garden, the river, and the man who had recently entered her life, Mr. Chung. Mr. Chung was a steady presence, a man whose quiet kindness had lit up her days like a lantern in the dark. He was a carpenter from the next village, with hands roughened by wood and a smile that felt like a rare gift in her lonely world. They had met one rainy afternoon when he'd helped her carry her vegetables to the market, his laughter a melody that had warmed her heart. Since then he had become a constant in her life, never demanding, always there with a kind word or a shared moment. He spoke of dreams, of building a better life, of crafting things that lasted. "I'll make you a proper roof one day," he'd said once, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "One that doesn't leak when it rains." Tieu Nuong had smiled, but inside, her heart had trembled. She wanted to believe in his words, in the future he painted with his quiet promises, but the scars of her past made her cautious, her hope a fragile thing, like a flower blooming in the shadow of a storm. She stood, her hands stained with dirt, her eyes fixed on the river in the distance. The flowers along its banks had been blooming for days, their petals a soft pink against the gray sky, but their beauty felt distant, a quiet reminder of the joy she could no longer reach. She thought of Mr. Chung, of the way his laughter had filled the silences in her life, of the warmth in his touch, the steadiness in his presence. "I wonder how he's doing," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the wind. It had been days since she'd last seen him, and the emptiness he left behind was a heavy weight on her heart. She wondered if he was eating well, if his work at the factory was too hard, if he thought of her as often as she thought of him. The sound of a motorbike broke her thoughts. Tieu Nuong looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Mr. Chung appeared at the edge of the field, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray sky, a woman beside him, her face softened by age but sharp with curiosity. "Nuong," he called, his voice warm, his smile a beacon of light in the grayness of her morning. He stepped closer, his boots sinking into the damp earth, the woman following behind, her eyes scanning the tent with a quiet intensity. "This is my mother," he said, his voice soft. "She wanted to meet you." Tieu Nuong felt her breath catch, her hands trembling slightly as she brushed the dirt from her shirt. She nodded, her cheeks flushing with a shy warmth, her heart a tangle of hope and fear. "Hello," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes meeting the woman's with a quiet plea. The woman, Mom Chung as Mr. Chung called her, smiled faintly, her gaze lingering on Tieu Nuong's face, then shifting to the tent, its sagging roof a stark contrast to the tidy rows of vegetables in the garden. "Hello, child," she said, her voice measured, her eyes sharp with a quiet judgment. "Do you live here alone?" Tieu Nuong nodded, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she said softly. "It's just me." The woman's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of sympathy passing through them, but there was something else there too. A distance, a hesitation that made Tieu Nuong's stomach twist with unease. Mr. Chung set a bag on the ground, his hands gentle as he opened it, revealing a package of candy, a small basket of fruit, and a few other gifts. "We bought these for you," he said, his voice warm. "They cost 85,000 dong. I thought you might like them." Tieu Nuong's eyes widened, a quiet joy spreading through her chest. But the joy was tinged with a familiar ache, a reminder of all the years she'd gone without such kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, her hands shaking as she took the candy, its wrapper crinkling softly in her fingers. She thought of her mother, of the way she'd once shared sweets with her on quiet evenings, the memory of faint light in the darkness of her solitude. They sat by the small fire Tieu Nuong had lit, its flames crackling softly, casting a warm glow over their faces. The air was cold, the wind whistling through the gaps in the tent, but the fire offered a small comfort, a quiet warmth that felt like a gift in itself. "It's too cold today," Mr. Chung said, his voice laced with concern. "You should wear a coat, it's easy to get sick in this weather." Tieu Nuong nodded, her eyes fixed on the flames, her heart swelling with a quiet gratitude. She glanced at Mom Chung, hoping for a smile, a sign of warmth, but the woman's gaze was fixed on the tent, her brow furrowed with concern. "This roof won't hold through the rainy season," she said, her voice firm. "It'll leak. How can you stay here like this?" Tieu Nuong swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the candy, her heart a tangle of shame and resilience. "Someone let me stay here," she said softly. "An acquaintance of Linda's. She helped me after I had nowhere else to go." Mr. Chung's eyes darkened, a quiet anger flickering in their depths. "I'll fix the roof before the rainy season," he said, his voice steady, his hands clenched into fists. "And when I get my salary in a few days, I'll buy more things for you. I've already planned it out." Tieu Nuong shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No need," she said softly. "I'll manage. When I earn enough, I'll buy what I need." But her words felt hollow, a quiet lie to mask the longing in her heart, the hope that Mr. Chung's presence might bring a warmth she'd long forgotten. Mom Chung watched them, her eyes sharp, her silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. She took a piece of fruit, her movement slow and deliberate, her gaze shifting between her son and the girl who sat before her. "You've met before, haven't you?" she asked, her voice measured, her eyes fixed on Tieu Nuong. Mr. Chung nodded, his expression softening. "Yes," he said. "When I came with Kwong, we found her here in this tent. She was in a bad place." Tieu Nuong felt her cheeks flush, her heart a tangle of shame and gratitude, her eyes fixed on the flames as the memories came rushing back. She thought of that day, of the way her uncle had cast her out, his words sharp as knives, his eyes cold with misunderstanding. She had been a child then, too young to fight back, too young to understand the weight of his accusations. He had thought she'd done something shameful, that her friendship with Mr. Chung and his friend Kwong was something to be ashamed of, and he had chased her from their home, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. She had wandered for days, her heart heavy with grief, until Linda, a kind woman from the village, had found her and offered her this tent, a fragile shelter in a world that had turned its back on her. "My uncle kicked me out," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the memory. He thought I was doing wrong, but I wasn't. I just wanted to survive." Mom Trung's eyes softened, a quiet sympathy passing through them, but there was something else there too, a distance, a hesitation that made Tieu Nuong's stomach twist with unease. "You've never been to school?" the woman asked, her voice gentle but probing, her eyes searching Tieu Nuong's face for answers. Tieu Nuong shook her head, her fingers tightening around the candy, her heart a tangle of shame and resilience. "No," she said softly. "I can't read, I never had the chance." Mom Chung nodded, her expression unreadable, her silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. The visit stretched on, each moment a quiet battle between hope and fear in Tieu Nuong's heart. Mr. Chung spoke of his plans, of the things he'd buy for her, of the roof he'd fix before the rains came. He spoke of his work at the factory, of the friend Kwong, who had been away for days, of the dreams he held for a better life. But Tieu Nuong's eyes kept drifting to Mom Chung, searching for a sign of acceptance, a glimmer of warmth that might ease the ache in her chest. She wanted to be seen, to be valued, to be more than the orphan girl with nothing to her name. But the woman's gaze was distant, her smile faint, her words careful and measured. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Mom Chung stood, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on her son. "We should go," she said, her voice firm. "There's work at the factory. A customer called and I need to handle it." Mr. Chung nodded, his expression tinged with regret, his eyes meeting Tieu Nuong's with a quiet promise. "I'll be back soon," he said softly, his voice warm. "Be careful, okay? And eat the fruit. It's good for you." Tieu Nuong nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her heart a tangle of longing and fear. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind, her hands clutching the candy as if it were a lifeline. They left, their figures growing smaller as they walked away, the sound of the motorbike fading into the distance. Tieu Nuong stood by the tent, the cold air biting at her skin, her heart heavy with a quiet ache. She thought of the visit, of the warmth in Mr. Chung's smile, of the distance in his mother's eyes. She thought of the life she led, of the garden that sustained her, of the river that whispered secrets in the night. And she thought of herself, of the girl she had become, strong but weary, hopeful but cautious. The moon rose, its silver light filtering through the trees, casting a glow over the tent, its broken roof a stark reminder of her fragile existence. Tieu Nuong sat by the fire, the flames flickering softly, the candy in her lap a quiet comfort against the chill of the night. She thought of Mr. Chung, of the dreams he held, of the promises he'd made. She thought of his mother, of the words she hadn't spoken, of the disapproval she'd felt in her gaze. And she wondered if Mr. Chung would return, if he would keep his promises, if he would see her as more than the orphan girl with nothing to her name. Would Mr. Chung return as he'd promised, his arms full of warmth and hope? Would Tieu Nuong find the courage to trust again, to hope again? Or would she remain as she was? A solitary figure in a broken tent, surrounded by the river and the memories of a life once shared? The moonlight offered no answers, only its silent, silver glow, and the river whispered softly, a quiet witness to her longing. For now Tieu Nuong had the garden, the candy, and the memory of a man who had brought light to her days, a small constellation of hope in the vast starry sky of her life.